In 1940, Britain stood alone. Its army escaped, but without weapons. Its cities were defenseless. Across the Channel, the most powerful war machine in history prepared to strike. Everyone believed invasion was inevitable. Everyone except history. Hitler had Britain within reach and still chose not to take it. One decision, one mistake, a moment of hesitation that changed the fate of the world. Subscribe to WW2 Unspoken History, where we uncover the stories history never told.
In 1940, as Europe collapsed one country after another, under the speed and brutality of Hitler's blitzkrieg, it seemed inevitable that Britain would be next. France had fallen in just 6 weeks. An army once considered unbeatable was gone. The British Army barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were saved, but almost everything else was left behind. Tanks, artillery, heavy weapons. Britain stood alone, isolated, exhausted, vulnerable. At that moment, the war could have ended differently, because this was Britain's weakest hour, and it should have been Hitler's moment to strike. But instead, he hesitated. Hitler believed Britain would do what others had done, that faced with isolation and defeat, it would seek peace, that negotiations would replace resistance. That assumption was his first great mistake, because while Hitler waited, Britain prepared. Factories restarted, airfields filled, pilots trained, defenses strengthened, the Royal Air Force regrouped, radar stations came online, and a nation that looked beaten found its resolve. That hesitation gave Britain the one thing it needed most. Not weapons, not allies, but time. And with time, Britain survived. And by surviving, it changed the course of the war. What looked like mercy was miscalculation. What seemed like patience became a fatal delay. This was not the end of the war. It was the beginning of Hitler losing control of it. The evacuation of Dunkirk was celebrated as a miracle. And in many ways, it was. More than 300,000 soldiers were saved from capture, from death. But strategically, Dunkirk was also a disaster, because those men returned home without the tools of war. No tanks, no artillery, almost no heavy equipment. From across the English Channel, Hitler watched closely, and he drew a dangerous conclusion. He believed Britain could not possibly continue the fight without an army capable of defending itself. That defeat was only a matter of time. What he failed to understand was that wars are not won by weapons alone. They are won by will. And Dunkirk did something unexpected. It did not break Britain. It hardened it. The evacuation ignited a determination. Across the country, a belief that survival itself was resistance, that surrender was no longer an option. Britain had lost its weapons, but it had found its resolve, and that resolve would soon change the course of the war. Hitler's misunderstanding of Britain went deeper than the battlefield. He did not see the British Empire as an enemy that needed to be destroyed, but as a potential partner in a reshaped world. In his imagination, Germany would rule continental Europe, while Britain would retain control of its overseas empire. Two powers, not enemies. That illusion shaped his choices. Instead of striking immediately, Hitler delayed invasion plans, convinced that diplomatic pressure and fear would eventually force Britain to negotiate. He believed time was on his side, but while Hitler waited, Britain prepared. Winston Churchill, newly appointed as Prime Minister, did not speak of compromise. He did not prepare the nation for peace, he prepared the British people for hardship, for sacrifice. and for a long and painful war. One side waited for surrender. The other prepared to endure. And in that difference, the course of World War II began to change. When Hitler finally turned his attention to invading Britain, under a plan known as Operation Sea Lion, the reality of Germany's limitations became impossible to ignore. The German Navy was no match for the Royal Navy, the most powerful naval force on Earth. Germany also lacked the specialized landing ships needed for a large-scale amphibious assault. An invasion across the English Channel was not just risky. It was nearly impossible. There was only one way it could work. Germany would first have to destroy Britain's air defenses and gain complete control of the skies. Without air superiority, any crossing would end in catastrophe. That requirement transformed the war. Because before an invasion could begin, another battle had to be fought. Not on land, not at sea. But in the air. And that necessity set the stage for one of the most decisive air battles in history, the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain began with relentless German air attacks. Radar stations were struck first, then airfields, then aircraft factories. The goal was simple: break the Royal Air Force. Before it could fight back, British pilots were pushed to the edge of exhaustion. They flew mission after mission with little rest. Planes were lost faster than they could be replaced. Fuel shortages threatened to ground entire squadrons. For a brief moment, it appeared Britain's air defenses might collapse entirely. Had that happened, the skies would have belonged to Germany. And with control of the air, a German invasion of Britain would have been possible. Britain had little ability to stop it. This was the narrowest margin of the war. A moment when defeat seemed not just possible, but imminent. And yet, Britain held on. That moment passed not because Britain was stronger, but because Hitler made a catastrophic strategic decision. After a small British bombing raid struck Berlin, the damage was minimal. But the humiliation was not. For Hitler, the attack was personal. A blow to pride. A challenge to authority. And in a fit of rage, he changed the course of the battle. He ordered the Luftwaffe to abandon attacks on RAF airfields and radar stations, the very targets that were pushing Britain to the edge, and instead focus on bombing London and other major cities. What had been a calculated military campaign became an emotional campaign of revenge. The pressure on the Royal Air Force eased. Airfields were repaired. Pilots rested. Squadrons reorganized. Without meaning to, Hitler handed Britain a lifeline it had not earned on the battlefield. And in war, a single decision like that can change everything. The bombing of London, later known as the Blitz, inflicted terrible suffering on civilians. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Thousands were killed. Millions were driven into shelters night after night. Cities burned. Homes vanished. Families lived underground, waiting for dawn. Yet the attacks did not break Britain's morale. They hardened it. Instead of fear, the bombing created defiance. Civilians endured together. Communities held firm. Surrender became unthinkable. And while German bombers targeted cities, something critical happened elsewhere. The Royal Air Force recovered. Damaged airfields were repaired. Squadrons reorganized. Pilots rested, rearmed, and returned to the sky. Slowly. Britain regained control of the air. The strategy meant to crush. Britain did the opposite. It ensured Britain's survival. And in war, survival is often the first step toward victory. By late 1940, the reality was impossible to deny. Germany had failed to defeat the Royal Air Force. Britain's skies were still contested, but they were no longer collapsing. At sea, the balance was even clearer. The Royal Navy remained dominant, controlling the waters that any invasion force would have to cross. An assault on Britain now carried a single outcome: disaster. Reluctantly, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion. Then, quietly, he abandoned it Altogether, Britain stood, alone, scarred, exhausted, but undefeated, and that survival mattered more than anyone could yet see, because Britain became something far greater than a nation holding on. It became a permanent base, a fortress from which Germany's enemies would regroup, rearm, and one day return to continental Europe. The invasion that never came changed the war as surely as any battle that did. Britain had endured, and by enduring, it ensured that the fight against Nazi Germany was far from over. Rather than finishing the fight in the West, Hitler turned his attention eastward in 1941. He launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union, convinced that Britain isolated and without allies would eventually collapse on its own. It was a fatal assumption. The invasion opened a second front of unimaginable scale. Millions of soldiers, thousands of miles. A war of attrition Germany was never prepared to fight. Instead of forcing Britain out of the war, Hitler trapped Germany in a conflict on multiple fronts, stretching manpower, resources, and leadership to the breaking point. Then the war expanded again. When the United States entered the conflict, Germany found itself facing an industrial and military coalition unmatched in history. Factories replaced losses faster than Germany could destroy them. Armies grew where Germany shrank. In the end, Hitler's earlier hesitation toward Britain became one of the defining causes of his defeat. By failing to eliminate Britain when he had the chance, he ensured that Germany would one day face the combined power of the world, and that was a war no empire could win. In the end, Hitler's failure to invade Britain was not caused by a single lost battle or a lack of military power. It was the result of a chain of miscalculations driven by arrogance, misjudgment, and ego. He underestimated Britain's resolve. He overestimated the power of terror bombing. And he allowed emotion to override strategy at the most critical moment of the war. What should have been a decisive campaign became a series of delays, assumptions, and missed opportunities. By hesitating when action mattered most, Hitler made a choice that altered the course of World War II. Because history does not always turn on strength alone. Sometimes, even the most powerful armies are undone by a single moment of hesitation.